I arrived in Ravenshade on a cold, gray afternoon. The town looked exactly like the kind of place I needed, a quiet escape from my ruined career, a place where no one would recognize me. Rows of old houses lined the narrow streets, their roofs sloping under the weight of time. A few shops sat close together, their signs faded and wooden. Everything seemed normal at first, but there was something off. It wasn't the way people watched me from their windows when I drove in. It wasn't even the way conversations died when I stepped inside the town's only diner that evening. It was something else, something I couldn't put into words yet. I sat at the counter, stirring a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The waitress, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes, had barely spoken a word since handing it to me. Trying to break the silence, I asked, "Does it always get this quiet at night?" The room stiffened. A few of the other customers glanced at each other. The waitress, whose name tag read Martha, hesitated before answering. "It's just how things are here," she said, wiping the counter harder than she needed to. I frowned. "What do you mean?" She sighed and leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "Nothing you need to worry about. You're new, right?" I nodded. "Then listen to me," she said. "When the clocks hit midnight, you go home. Lock your doors, close your curtains, and don't look outside. Not even for a second." I chuckled, thinking it was some local joke. "Sounds serious." She didn't laugh. "It is." The diner fell back into silence. The air felt thicker somehow, as if I had touched on a subject I wasn't supposed to. That was my first warning. Later that night, I stepped outside and felt the town change around me. The streets, which had seemed normal during the day, now felt too empty. The air had a weight to it, a kind of pressure that made my skin tingle. As I walked to my small apartment above the town's bookstore, I noticed something strange. People were shutting their windows and locking their doors with urgency. I passed an old man dragging a wooden board across his front door, hammering it into place. Another house had its curtains drawn so tightly that not a single crack of light could escape. A woman across the street was piling furniture against her front door, her hands moving quickly, her face pale. The town wasn't just going to sleep. It was sealing itself shut. I reached my apartment, my mind buzzing with questions. What were they so afraid of? Was this some strange small-town superstition? Inside, I sat by the window watching. Midnight was minutes away. The street outside was deserted, every home dark, every door locked. Then, at exactly 12:06 a.m., something happened. The streetlights flickered, once, twice, then went out completely. The town was swallowed by perfect silence. No wind, no insects, no distant hum of power lines. Nothing. Then, through the stillness, my radio turned on by itself. A soft, crackling sound filled my apartment. Static. Whispers. Faint at first, but growing clearer. I froze. Because the voice coming through the radio, it was mine. The first time I heard about the lockdown, I thought it was a joke. 12 minutes, the bartender Joe had said, wiping down the counter. "That's all. Just stay inside. Keep the lights off. Don't look outside." His tone was casual, but the way his hands tightened around the rag told me it was anything but. "And if I do?" I asked, leaning forward. "If I look outside?" Joe's eyes flicked up to mine, his expression unreadable. "You don't want to do that." That was the end of the conversation. The other patrons in the bar had gone quiet. They weren't going to talk about it, not with an outsider like me. But the silence spoke louder than words. They were afraid. That night, I stayed up late in my small apartment above the bar, waiting for midnight. I had lived in Ravenshade for a little over a week, and the town's strangeness was starting to get under my skin. The way people hurried home before dark. The way shopkeepers closed early with nervous glances at the sky. The way no one, not even the stray dogs, walked the streets after midnight. At exactly 12:06 a.m., the entire town went silent. Not just quiet, silent. The hum of streetlights died. The wind outside my window stopped. The old pipes in my building, which groaned and rattled at all hours, fell completely still. It was an unnatural silence, the kind that presses against your ears, making you hyper-aware of your own heartbeat. I walked to the window, my breath slow and careful. The street below was empty. Not a single light shone from the houses. The town looked abandoned, frozen in time. I checked my watch. 12:07. A shadow flickered in the corner of my vision. I turned my head too quickly, my pulse spiking, but there was nothing there. Just my reflection in the glass, staring back at me with wide, alert eyes. I let out a shaky breath and stepped back. Maybe it really was just a town tradition. Maybe the people here were just weird. 12:08. Then I heard it. A low static noise, like an old radio tuning between stations. It came from the small radio on my nightstand, the one I hadn't used since moving in. The volume dial twisted on its own. I took a step closer, watching my stomach tightening into knots. The static deepened, and then a whisper. Soft, garbled, but I understood it. My name. The voice on the radio whispered my name. Every hair on my body stood on end. 12:09. I backed away from the radio, my breath shallow. I reached for the knob, but before I could touch it, the whisper changed. You see me. A sharp chill crawled down my spine. I wasn't touching the radio, but the dial kept turning, shifting through static, the whisper growing louder. 12:10. The whisper faded, and for a moment I thought it was over. Then from outside, something creaked, like a footstep on an old wooden floor. I turned my head toward the window, heart hammering. The street was still empty, still lifeless, but I had the sudden, suffocating feeling that something was there, something standing just out of sight, watching. 12:11. I backed away from the window, my body tense. The rules played over in my mind. Stay inside. Keep the lights off. Don't look outside. I wasn't breaking any of them, was I? Another step creaked outside. Closer this time. 12:12. The silence in my apartment was unbearable. The air itself felt heavier, pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. My hands clenched in a fist at my sides. I needed to do something. I reached for my phone. No signal. Of course. The creaking stopped. The silence stretched. My ears rang with it. I counted the seconds in my head, willing time to move faster. 12:13. Then, just when I thought I had imagined it all, a shadow passed by my window. Not a person. Not an animal. Something else. Something wrong. It was tall, stretched too thin, its movements unnatural. It didn't walk. It glided. A shifting darkness that bent the air around it, like heat rising from pavement. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My instincts screamed at me to not look, but I was frozen, eyes locked onto the thing outside. And then, as if it sensed me, it stopped. Its head, if it had a head, turned toward me. The streetlight beside it flickered once, then went out. 12:14. I stumbled backward, heart slamming against my ribs. Don't look. Don't look. I shut my eyes tight, my breath coming in fast, uneven gasps. The radio crackled again. Closer this time. You see me. The voice wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was coming from inside the room. 12:15. The door to my apartment rattled. The knob twisted. I backed into the corner, hands pressed against the wall, my entire body trembling. 12:16. The rattling stopped. The radio went silent. The air shifted, as if something had stepped away. 12:17. I didn't move. Couldn't move. My eyes stayed shut, my breath trapped in my throat. The seconds stretched on endlessly. 12:18. The air returned to normal. The pipes groaned. A distant dog barked. The town came back to life, as if nothing had happened. I opened my eyes. The street outside was empty again. The radio was off. The door was locked. But I knew something had been there. Something had seen me. And now I knew I had seen it too. I shouldn't have looked. I know that now. But that night, curiosity was stronger than fear. The town had settled into its usual eerie silence. Every house locked up, every window covered. No one dared step outside after 12:06 a.m. Not even the stray dogs I sometimes saw wandering during the day. The street lights still flickered in that odd way, like something unseen was brushing against them. I sat by my window, barely breathing. The air outside looked thicker, heavier, as if the darkness itself had weight. I had my phone in hand, ready to record, though I had a strange feeling that it wouldn't help. At exactly 12:06 a.m., the streetlights died out. Not all at once, one by one. A domino effect of darkness swallowing Ravenshade whole. I gripped the edge of the window, my heartbeat hammering in my chest. And then I saw it, a figure. Tall, unnaturally tall, asterisk, asterisk, it stood in the middle of the street, wrapped in shadows. It had no face, no real form. It was just absence, like a hole in reality, something my eyes could barely process. The longer I stared, the more my head ached, like my brain was rejecting what it was seeing. It moved slowly, soundlessly, drifting forward like it wasn't touching the ground. A low hum filled the air, a vibration more than a sound. My phone crackled with static, the screen flickering. I should have backed away. I should have shut my eyes. But I was frozen. The Hollow Man, because I knew deep down that's what it was, stopped, right in front of my building, and turned. Not with a head. It had no head, but I felt it looking at me. My lungs seized. My hands turned ice cold. The air around me warped, like heat rising from asphalt, but in reverse, sucking all warmth out of the world. And then, something even worse happened. The window glass fogged up, not from my breath, from outside. Something unseen, something cold, was just inches away. My radio, which had been silent, crackled to life. A whisper. My own voice. "I'm sorry, you shouldn't be looking. _ I slammed the curtains shut, stumbling back so fast I nearly tripped. My hands shook, my breaths came too fast. The hum outside grew louder for a few unbearable seconds. I pressed my hands over my ears. Then, silence. Long empty. Finally, at exactly 12:18 a.m., the street lights flickered back on. I waited until morning before daring to look outside again. The street was empty. Nothing had changed, except for one thing. A house, just across from mine, remained shut. The door bolted, the windows covered. No movement inside. The house belonged to Mr. Thompson, an old man I'd seen watering his plants just yesterday. He never came outside again, and no one in town ever spoke his name. I had made a mistake, and now the Hollow Man knew I existed. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. The figure moving through the dark, its faceless head turning ever so slightly, as if it could sense me watching. The street lights had flickered out in its wake, like the very presence of that thing drained the life from them. And then there was the house, the one that never reopened. No one talked about it. No one even glanced at it the next morning. It was as if the people inside had never existed. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the truth settled deep inside me, heavy and cold. Something was terribly wrong with this town, and now whatever was new, I had seen it. The next evening, I made my way to the town's library. I didn't know what I was looking for, just that I needed answers. The librarian, Mrs. Holloway, was one of the oldest people in town. She had been here long before any of the other residents, long before the world outside seemed to forget Ravenshade even existed. If anyone knew the truth, it would be her. The library was nearly empty. The overhead lights buzzed softly, casting long shadows between the towering bookshelves. Mrs. Holloway sat behind the desk, flipping through a tattered book. When I approached, she glanced up, her sharp eyes narrowing. "You look like a man carrying a burden," she said, her voice dry and brittle like old paper. I hesitated before speaking. I saw it. The room went silent. Mrs. Holloway's face darkened. She carefully placed her book down and folded her hands over it. "You shouldn't have." I swallowed hard. "What is it?" For a long time, she didn't answer. Instead, she reached under her desk, pulled out an old newspaper, and slid it toward me. The date was faded, but the headline sent a chill through me. 12 missing in Ravenshade, no traces found. The article was decades old. It spoke of families who had vanished overnight, their homes found locked from the inside. No signs of struggle. No footprints. No bodies. Just empty rooms, cold beds, unfinished meals on the table. I looked up at Mrs. Holloway. She leaned forward. "It feeds on attention," she whispered. "The more you acknowledge it, the stronger it becomes." My breath caught in my throat. "That's why we locked down," she continued. "Not to keep it out, to keep it weak." A cold, creeping realization settled over me. By watching it, by thinking about it, I had done exactly what the town had tried so hard to avoid. I had made it stronger. Mrs. Holloway studied my face, then sighed. It knows you now. I stumbled back to my apartment, my mind racing. The words echoed in my skull. It knows you now. As I stepped inside, I hesitated, glancing toward the hallway mirror. Something felt off. My reflection stood there, same as always. Same clothes. Same tired face. But there was something different, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Then I saw it. My reflection was breathing, just a little too slow. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I turned away, heart hammering. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was just sleep-deprived. The radio on my kitchen counter crackled to life. At first, it was just static. Then, beneath the noise, I heard it. A voice. My voice. You shouldn't have looked. The room around me seemed to darken, as if the walls were closing in. The air turned heavy, thick with something unseen. I backed away from the radio, from the mirror, from everything. Outside, the sun was beginning to set. The streetlights flickered. The town was preparing for another night. Another 12 minutes. And this time, I wasn't sure I'd make it through. The first time I heard it, my door rattling like someone was shaking it with all their might, I thought I was imagining things. It was exactly 12:06 a.m., just like the others. The town had locked itself away for the night, but I couldn't bring myself to sleep. Not with the way everything felt wrong. I've been staying up longer and longer each night, trying to piece together something that made sense. I had a plan, survive the night, but I knew deep down there was no escaping it. The rattling came again, louder this time. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I froze. The night outside had swallowed the town, leaving only the dark hum of the clock on the wall. The shadows in the room seemed to twist and stretch, like they were breathing in time with my own rapid pulse. I didn't want to look at the door. I didn't want to see what was on the other side. But I couldn't stop myself. I stood, the floorboards creaking under my feet, and slowly crept toward the door. With every step, the air felt heavier, colder. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Another rattle. I grabbed the doorknob. My hand was trembling. I pulled it open, just a crack, enough to peek into the hallway. Nothing. The hallway was as empty as it had been when I first arrived here. The air felt thick, too thick. The silence was crushing, like it was pressing against my skull. I stepped back. My fingers left the doorknob. But then I heard it again, a faint whisper. I froze. It was coming from my radio. That damn radio. I hadn't touched it in days, but there it was, crackling to life. I approached it slowly, my mind racing. The whispers weren't clear at first. They were muffled, like they were coming from a far-off place, but there was one thing that froze me in place. The whispers, they sounded like me. My voice. My voice. Elias. Wake up. Elias. You know what you've done? I couldn't breathe. I stepped back from the radio, but it followed me, the voice growing louder with each passing second. My own name echoed in the room, but it wasn't me saying it. I didn't say it. I covered my ears, but the sound seeped through. My heart was racing, my breath shallow. The Hollow Man, it was real, and it was already here. In a panic, I grabbed my phone, trying to call for help, but no one answered. There was no one to call. The whole town was locked down, just as it always was. The phone's screen flickered, and I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the black glass. But something wasn't right. I hadn't moved. I was still standing in front of the radio, but my reflection was walking toward the door. I blinked, and in that split second, it was me standing in the hallway. My reflection in the phone screen was no longer looking at me. It was staring at the door, like it had a mind of its own, like it wanted to go outside. I dropped the phone. I didn't know what was real anymore. Was it the man in the hallway, the one I could see with my own eyes, or the one in the reflection? Was I going mad, or was the Hollow Man doing this to me? I ran to the door. I yanked it open wide. The hallway was empty. I didn't know if I felt relieved or even more terrified, but I couldn't ignore the feeling in my chest, the ache that something was watching me, waiting. I pulled the door shut again, locking it this time. I stepped back, my head spinning, and then my phone started buzzing. Messages. I opened them, desperate for anything to distract me from what was happening. But when I looked at the screen, my stomach dropped. They were all from me. You've already seen it. It knows you now. You're next. I couldn't breathe. I slammed the phone down on the table. This wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't come here for this. But it didn't matter. The Hollow Man knew my name. It knew who I was. I'd already acknowledged it, and I couldn't escape it. The clock on the wall ticked again, counting down the seconds. I couldn't hear anything but the tick-tock growing louder and louder, until it was the only thing left in the world. Then, suddenly, the silence shattered. A sound, like glass breaking, echoed through the room. The window behind me had shattered. But when I turned to look, there was no glass on the floor. No shards to be found. The window was perfectly intact. A movement, something darker than darkness, moved across the corner of my eye. And then I heard it, a soft whispering from behind me. I turned, my legs frozen to the floor. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls had closed in. And there, standing in the corner, just beyond the shadows, was the Hollow Man. I hadn't seen it clearly before, but now I did. The tall, thin figure, its faceless head tilted at an unnatural angle, its body stretched out of proportion. It didn't make a sound. It didn't have to. I knew now. There was no way out. I had broken the rule. I had looked at it. And now it was my turn. I couldn't fight it. There was nowhere to run. The town had already sealed itself tight around me, and the Hollow Man had already claimed me. The whisper came again, this time so close it burned my skin. You should have looked away. And just like that, I couldn't move anymore. Time stopped. Everything faded into nothingness. And I understood. There was no way out. I had tried everything. Every single thing. But here I was, standing in front of my window, heart pounding in my chest as the clock ticked closer to 12:06 a.m. My hands trembled, and my palms were slick with sweat. I wasn't sure if it was fear, desperation, or both. I had tried to run from Ravenshade, tried to escape, but the roads had looped me right back to this cursed town. No matter how many times I drove, no matter which direction I turned, I always ended up at the same place, my apartment, facing the same nightmare. The Hollow Man was coming. I knew it. I couldn't hide from it anymore. It had followed me. It had been getting closer every night. I felt its presence, like a heavy weight pressing on my chest, pushing the air out of my lungs. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer. Every flicker of the streetlights felt like a warning. The whispers on the radio, my own voice, had become a constant companion, reminding me, torturing me. There was no escape. Tonight, though, tonight would be different. Tonight I was going to face it. No more running. No more pretending. I would look at it, even if it meant my end. The clock on the wall read 12:03 a.m. 3 minutes. I turned off the lights, even though I knew it didn't matter. The town locked itself down at midnight. Everyone was behind closed doors, all windows sealed tight. They were hiding from the same thing I was about to confront, and part of me hated them for it. I'd spent days trying to figure out why they did it, what they were so afraid of, and now I knew. They were all cowards. Every last one of them. I wasn't afraid anymore. Or maybe I was, but I wouldn't let it control me. I'd stare into the darkness. I'd look into its eyes, and I'd finally understand what had been tormenting this place for so long. I had to. The house was still. Too still. The air outside felt thick, like the world itself was holding its breath. There was no sound except the quiet ticking of the clock. The wind outside had stopped. Even the rustling of leaves had ceased. Nothing. 12:06 a.m. The room went dark. The lights flickered once, then cut out completely. A heavy silence filled the space. A silence so deep it felt like the entire world had paused, like time itself was holding its breath. I didn't move. I didn't dare. I just stood there, waiting. My eyes scanned the street through the crack in the blinds. The world outside was a void of blackness, the streetlights extinguished, the trees standing still like dark sentinels. But then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a distortion in the air. A figure, tall and stretched, moving down the street with an unnatural slowness. I could see the air around it warp, the space bending and twisting like it didn't quite belong. The Hollow Man. He was here. I felt my breath catch in my throat. My pulse hammered in my ears. My body froze. My mind screaming for me to look away, to run, to do anything but keep watching, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It was tall, so tall it seemed to scrape the sky, its limbs unnaturally long and thin, wrapped in dark shadows that seemed to spill from it like ink. Its face it had none. No features. Just darkness. An empty void where a face should have been. It was moving toward my building. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my legs were cemented to the floor, and the air around me felt heavier, suffocating. It knew I was watching. I had looked at it, and now there was no turning back. As the hollow man drew closer, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. I could see my breath now, thick and white in the air. It felt like everything was closing in. The walls seemed to shift. The floor felt uneven beneath me. The silence deepened, pressing in, until I thought my head might explode from the pressure. The figure stopped in front of my window. For a long moment, it stood perfectly still, like it was waiting for something, like it was waiting for me to do something. Then it turned, slowly, deliberately, it turned its head toward me. I felt a chill run through my body. It could see me, it was looking at me. It knew me. The hollow man's presence was so overwhelming, so suffocating, that I couldn't breathe. It was as though every part of my body screamed in terror, but I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. It was pulling me in, dragging me closer to it, like some invisible force was wrapping around my throat, squeezing tighter and tighter with every passing second. I should have looked away. I should have listened to the warnings. I should have stayed inside, should have locked myself away like everyone else. But it was too late. The hollow man stepped closer. The shadows around it seemed to crawl, to stretch out, as if they had a life of their own. The darkness reached for me, like hands, cold and unfeeling, that wanted to drag me into that endless void behind its faceless mask. And then, the room went completely dark. The radio crackled to life. Asterisk, asterisk, you should have looked away, asterisk, asterisk. It was my voice, but I didn't speak. It was as if the hollow man was using my own words against me. The same words I had been hearing every night. The same words that had been etched into my mind since the moment I arrived. I heard a noise behind me, a low, guttural sound like something was moving in the shadows, closer, closer. I couldn't move. The darkness surrounded me, swallowed me whole. And then, 12:18 a.m., when the town awoke the next morning, there was no trace of me. My apartment was locked tight, just as it always had been. No one spoke of me again. No one mentioned my name. I had become part of the town's history, like the others before me, forgotten in the silence of Ravenshade. But somewhere, out there, in the dark corners of the world, the hollow man still waits. And the next fool will come. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the dusty streets of Ravenshade. The town had been quiet for hours now, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. As the day stretched on, the silence settled deeper, as if the entire town was holding its breath. A young man, no older than 25, pulled into the narrow, winding street in an old, rusty sedan. His name was Adam, and he had just moved to Ravenshade, seeking a fresh start. Like Elias before him, he had no idea what was waiting for him in this place. He parked in front of an old, worn-down apartment building. The building looked abandoned, its once bright paint chipped and fading, the windows dull and cracked. But Adam didn't care. He had seen worse places. Besides, he wasn't here to make friends or be a part of the town's story. He just wanted to escape from the mess his life had become. Grabbing his backpack from the passenger seat, Adam made his way to the front door. His footfalls echoed eerily as he walked up the staircase. The air smelled stale, like old paper and dust. The apartment door in front of him was marked with a faded number, 13. He paused for a moment, glancing down at his phone, as if checking for messages. But there was nothing. No notifications. Just silence. He knocked lightly on the door, and after a moment, it creaked open. Standing there was the bartender he had met earlier that day. His face was familiar, a little too familiar, and his smile was tight, almost forced. "Looking for a place to stay?" the bartender asked, his voice steady but cold. There was something about the man's eyes that made Adam uneasy, but he didn't dwell on it. "Yeah, I'm the new guy moving in," Adam said, trying to sound casual. He stepped into the apartment building, but something about the air felt off. The kind of heaviness that pressed down on your chest, making it hard to breathe. The bartender gave a stiff nod. "It's been vacant for a while," he said, glancing briefly over his shoulder toward the hallway. "But I guess it's yours now." He stepped aside to let Adam pass. The apartment was small, sparse furniture, just a single bed, a cracked dresser, and a chair by the window. The place had clearly been empty for months, maybe even years. The curtains were drawn shut, and the air smelled stale, as if no one had been there in a long time. Adam tossed his bag onto the bed and made his way to the window. He pulled back the heavy curtain, looking out into the street. The town was quiet. Too quiet. It was the kind of stillness that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The sun was setting, and the sky was slowly turning orange, casting a dull glow across the horizon. As he stood there, he heard the soft creak of the apartment door behind him. He turned to see the bartender standing in the doorway, his lips curling into a tight smile. "You know," the bartender said, his voice low and almost too calm, "you're lucky. Most people who come here, they don't last long." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But you'll be fine." Adam frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" The bartender's smile never wavered. "It's a small town. People come and go, but some of us never leave. You'll get used to it. Just follow the rules." Adam opened his mouth to ask what rules he was talking about, but the bartender turned and started walking away, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. "Wait," Adam called after him. "What do you mean by the rules?" The bartender paused at the end of the hall and looked back over his shoulder, his eyes gleaming with something Adam couldn't quite place. "Don't worry," the bartender said softly. "You'll know soon enough." The apartment door clicked shut behind him, leaving Adam standing alone in the room. A cold chill suddenly washed over him. He shivered, rubbing his arms, and glanced around, as if looking for something he couldn't quite see. He stepped away from the window, feeling a strange unease crawling up his spine. His eyes flickered toward the clock on the wall. The time was 11:55 p.m. A slow, creeping thought crossed his mind, but he shook it away. He'd been in plenty of towns before, plenty of strange places. There was nothing to be afraid of here, right? Just as he turned back toward the bed, the radio on the dresser suddenly crackled to life, its static filling the room. Adam froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The radio didn't work. He hadn't even plugged it in yet. Then, the voice came through the static. "You should have looked away." A chill ran through him, colder than anything he had ever felt before. His eyes darted toward the window, his breath catching in his throat. The air around him felt thick, as if the room itself was pressing in on him. The clock ticked over to 12:06 a.m. Outside, in the street, something moved in the darkness. Something tall, faceless, and wrong. Adam's breath caught in his throat as his eyes locked onto the figure, standing motionless under the street lamp. It was watching him. The radio crackled again, louder now, the voice growing clearer. "It knows you now." And Adam, like so many before him, realized he had stepped into the town's trap. And now, there would be no way out.